Hey guys, Frank Spear back with you for another episode of Watch This. And this is going to be a really short one today. Let's take a look at Revelation chapter 7. We know that this book is filled with symbolism, right? We know that the beasts are not literal creatures, right? But we're referring to the Roman Empire in the book of Revelation, the beast. We know that the dragon and the serpent is referring to apostate Judaism, the rulers of that system. We know that the lamb is not a literal lamb, right? Not an animal, but referring to Messiah, Jesus. We know that the locusts are not literal grasshopper type creatures, but they're referring to the Roman armies. We know that the lampstands are not literal lampstands, but they're referring to the churches. We know that the stars are not literal stars, but they're referring to the leaders of those churches. Do we need to go on? We know that the new heavens and the new earth, as well as the old heavens and the old earth, were not literally speaking of the sky and the planet, but a covenant system. We know that the seals that were broken and the trumpets that were blown and on and on and on were not literal. Yet there are some who would agree with all of that, but yet they come to a passage like this with the 144,000 here in Revelation chapter 7, and they say that the 144,000 were standing before the throne of God in heaven, and that is literal. That they were literally caught up somewhere in an invisible realm, standing before a literal chair that God is literally seated on. So the Father has a body, literally, of some type where he can sit his behind down, his divine behind, in a literal chair. That doesn't work. And most of us know that doesn't work. Heavenly places, or the heavens, is significant. A sign, significant, is depicting in figurative language God's authority, his rule. Turn to Ephesians if you would. Let's start in chapter 2. And let's begin reading in verse 4. But God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions. Now they weren't literally dead, right? Because he's writing to them and he's including himself in the group. He says, we were dead. Well, he's obviously not talking about biological death. So here's another symbol. He made us alive together with Christ. Now that's not talking about resurrection from the biological death, because we know that this isn't speaking of biological death, right? So there's a type of resurrection here. He made us alive together with Christ. And it's by grace you've been saved. The saved is the same as the being made alive. You've been rescued out from the old covenant system. Watch this. And he has raised us up with him and seated us with him in heavenly places. Was that literal? Were they literally, at the time they put their faith in Messiah Jesus, sucked away into an invisible realm and sat down in a chair that was made for them in an invisible realm? No more than they were literally dead or literally made biologically alive again. This is, again, just like in Revelation 7, figuratively speaking of them now ruling with Messiah in his new covenant kingdom, being a part of that kingdom, and being a part of that new covenant community that replaced and would replace at the very end, that would replace God's system of rule and authority in the old covenant system. Flip over to Ephesians, 3. Let's go to 3 verse 10. Let's start in verse 8. To me, the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of Christ, and to bring to light what is the administration of the mystery, which for ages has been hidden in God, who created all things being the covenant, the old covenant system. The temple, the sacrifices, the priests, the land, the holy land, right? The holy city, the holy temple, all that went with that, all the furniture in the tabernacle and all of the significance of those things. Those are the all things here. He created all things so that the manifold wisdom of God might now, in these last days, be made known through the church to the rulers and authorities in the heavenlies, in the heavenly places, in the heavens. Well, who was the manifold wisdom of God being made known to? Who were those seated in the heavenly places? Well, I believe this is speaking of the rulers of the Old Covenant system, who were seated in heavenly places, right? They were the authorities in the Old Covenant system. And now the manifold wisdom of God was being made known to them in these last days, giving them a chance to come out from the old system into the new rule in the heavenly places. That's the new covenant. Just another way of saying that. To come into the new house of God's authority. The new community where God would reign and rule. That's the throne. Right? Flip over to Ephesians chapter 6. Let's look at, let's look at verse 12. Let's start at verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord, brethren, and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. Who is the devil? Apostate Judaism and their leaders. Their leaders are the serpents. Their leaders are the devil. Their leaders are the Satanos, Satan. Their leaders are the dragon. These are the people who were cast down, thrown out of heaven in Revelation 12. Were they literally thrown out of heaven? If that's literal, then these people were in heaven and then thrown out from a literal invisible realm. No, we know that that's not what's happening here. This is symbolism. This is figurative language. This is poetic speech. Whatever else you want to call it. Watch this. Put on the full armor of God so they'll be able to stand strong, firm against the schemes of the devil. Right? Jesus called the Pharisees and those leaders of apostate Judaism the serpents. The serpents are synonymous with the devil in Revelation chapter 12. So they're the same people. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, we're not struggling against the nation of Israel itself, Paul is saying. We're not struggling against our fellow Israelites. We're struggling against their rulers. These are the ones who are plaguing us at every turn. These are the ones who are hindering the gospel at every turn. These are the ones who are imprisoning the saints, murdering the saints. Jesus said, you brood of vipers, you serpents, you've been murdering the prophets from the beginning. So the serpents were the murderers. They were the ones seeking to destroy the gospel. The Judaizers. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the powers, against the world forces. What's the world in the New Testament? We know that the world is the covenant system of Israel. Jesus says in John chapter 18 very plainly, I've spoken to the world. I've went into their synagogues and into their temple and preached to them. After he raises Lazarus from the dead, after he raises Lazarus from the dead, many of the Jews begin to follow Messiah. And the Pharisees say, look, the whole world is going out after him. That's the world. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness. Well, the old covenant system is called darkness throughout this book. John chapter 1. The light shone in the darkness. Where did Messiah come? Who did he come to? He came to old covenant Israel. And the light shone in the darkness. So it all just works perfectly. This is a perfect dovetail, a perfect fit. Watch this. Against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness, apostate Jews, in the heavenly places. They were sitting in the place of God's rule and authority as the leaders, the rulers, the stars in the heaven. They were the ones seated in the high places under the old covenant system, the heavenly places. They were stars in the heavens, just like the king of Tyre. In, what is it, in Isaiah? Or is it in, get confused sometimes, Ezekiel? Either one, either way, you know the passage I'm talking about. Talks about the king of Tyre seated on his throne as being cast out like a star being thrown out of heaven. So his place of rule and authority was the heavenly place. And he was a star being cast down to the earth, so to speak. So coming back to Revelation chapter 7, when the 144,000 are singing the new song before the throne of God, this is not literal. This is the same thing as all the other passages we just looked at. This is symbolic for they've come into the new rule of God, the new kingdom of God, the kingdom that Jesus, the Son, turned over to the Father so that he could take it over because Christ had brought it about. He's the one, Messiah, that came to put all enemies under his feet. Then he said, hey, Dad, I've completed my work. Here, this kingdom is for you eternally now. I've done the work you've given me to do. So the folks who make the argument that this was them literally standing in an invisible realm somewhere off in heaven as a literal place, unseen, they make that point because they want to say that these in the last days, the 144,000 symbolically representing the redeemed that were saved in AD 70, foreigners included in them because the foreigners became Israel. They became part of the house of Israel. So when it talks about 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, it's symbolic. It's not an exact number, of course. That foreigners would have been symbolically, as God-fearers, they would have been included in this number. That's what some people can't seem to get their mind around. They say, no, all Israel, Israel only. Well, the God-fearers became part of the house of Israel. So they're included here. They weren't circumcised and began to worship the God of Israel along with the Israelites and then maintained a different name or said, well, you're Israel, but you're not Israel. They were of the house of Israel at that point. Watch my video that I've just made called God Loves the Foreigners. And I think I show beyond a reasonable doubt that the door to fellowship with God and covenant with the God of the Bible was always open to non-Israelites. I believe my video makes the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Watch it for yourselves. So they like to make this case that although the whole book is symbolic, and they know that, and they teach that it is, but when they come to this somehow, some way, in some fashion, this is literal, and they were taken to heaven, and then nobody else could ever go to heaven. So this is the New Jerusalem for them. This throne of God is the New Jerusalem. Therefore, it's a literal place in an invisible realm, and nobody else can ever come into it. Anyway, that's it for today. I told you this would be a short one. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.